Thinking in Spanish and not translating is such a fascinating topic to me because I remember when I first started to think in Spanish, or at least attempting to think in Spanish, it was very challenging for me and I didn't really understand the whole process of thinking in Spanish. But now I have a better understanding. For example, when we are trying to think in Spanish, it doesn't have to be full sentences, for example, but we can just be saying single words and that will provoke us to think in Spanish. You could just be thinking about the lamp that you see. So you see many different items around you in your home, for example. You look at the wall, then you think to yourself, okay, what is wall in Spanish? You're like, okay, pared. Okay, la pared, la pared. Or you're looking at the lamp. You say, okay, la lámpara, I think. La lámpara. So it can be as simple as that, just saying single words and you're working through that word in your head. Is it a feminine word? Is it a masculine word? Does it have an accent mark? So that's one aspect of thinking in Spanish. I also think about it as, what is my mind focusing on in that very moment? So for example, right there, I was thinking about a specific word in Spanish. I was trying to figure out what was that word in Spanish. But before I started to think in Spanish and learn Spanish consistently, my brain was only focused on English. Everything I was doing every single day was in English. I wasn't thinking about Spanish words and trying to figure, what are different words in Spanish. So it is about action. I have to make sure that my brain is being focused on the Spanish language in some shape or form. So I can be going throughout my whole day thinking about these different Spanish words that I'm seeing around me, but I really have to force myself to do that. So I'm looking around, okay, la pared, el carro, el diccionario, el libro. And I'm doing that, but just in my head. Right now I'm saying it out loud, but it's the same thing that's happening in my head. By the way, it does not matter what your current level of Spanish is. If today is your day one, you can start doing this. But of course, maybe you may not have that much vocabulary that you know, but that is still fine because that is going to develop over time. Today you're walking around, but you can only name 4 different things that you see in Spanish. But maybe, a week from now, or 2 weeks from now, or 3 weeks from now, that quantity will increase to 40 different words or 30 different words in Spanish. And then when you start to learn more vocabulary, then you're not just looking at an item and maybe you're not just saying one word like el carro, but then you learn el carro es rojo. You're able to put more sentences together, so that's what you're going to be doing when you are thinking in Spanish throughout the day. El carro es rojo. Yo soy alto. Okay, yo soy alto. Yo soy alto. Again, what your brain is focusing on is key here because I don't have to be thinking in Spanish in this way, but I get to be thinking in my native language, English. I do these thinking exercises in Spanish all the time, every single day throughout the day, always just narrating what I see in Spanish, narrating what I'm doing in Spanish, como en este momento estoy grabando un video y yo tengo calor. Hace mucho calor hoy. But again, at the beginning of my thinking in Spanish journey, it wasn't that extensive. So again, I was just looking at different items around me and trying to name them in Spanish. Another big tip to think in Spanish and to not translate is to simply learn the Spanish language. Always consume Spanish. When we are learning Spanish, we are making our brains think about the Spanish language. I really want you to remember that. So it's all about action and focus. What our brain is focusing on. So of course, there are many different ways that we can learn Spanish. We could be listening to music in Spanish. We could be listening to the radio in Spanish. We could be listening to a podcast and also reading some, what do you call them? We could be reading the transcript of a podcast, or we could just be reading things online in Spanish. We could be reading a book in Spanish, and all these different things or all these different ways of learning Spanish provokes us to think in Spanish. And learning more about the Spanish language is exactly how we reduce the amount of time that we have to translate into our native language. So I know a lot of Spanish learners, they seem to really think that there's something wrong with them, but there actually is not. Number one, your brain is going to be translating back and forth kind of on its own sometimes. just because that's just how the brain works, because you have two languages going on in your head at the same time. But you have to translate back into your native language because you just don't have the right vocabulary that you need to really express yourself the way that you want to do, or to say the phrase that you would like to say, especially because phrases and sentences in between Spanish and English are not going to be the same. So for example, it's raining cats and dogs in English. Let's say that I want to say that in Spanish. Well, okay, you actually have to learn how to say that in Spanish, because it's not as simple as it's raining cats and dogs. Okay, está lloviendo gatos y perros. In Spanish, you would say está lloviendo a cántaros. So that is quite different. It's not the same. But again, if you just started to learn Spanish, or even for me, I don't think I learned that phrase for like a few years after I started to learn Spanish more seriously. But there's a lot of phrases that you may not know. So that's basically the main reason, and vocabulary in general, single words. So that is the main reason why you may have to translate a lot back into your native language. So there's nothing wrong with you, but you just have to continue to learn Spanish so you can learn all these nuances and all these new words and all these new phrases. Now, let's say that I am reviewing my vocabulary with flashcards in Spanish. So I have this card here, and it says moler. I don't know if you can see it properly, but this one says moler, and then this one says morder. So this is a really excellent way for you to think in Spanish. And again, I'm still learning the Spanish language through reviewing my flashcards. Moler, morder, and if I had other ones right in front of me, which I don't have right now, I would be continuing to think in Spanish, let's say for 10 or 15 minutes. Writing is also a really good way to make sure that you are thinking in Spanish throughout the day. And then also it's a good way just to review Spanish in general. So I have something written down here in Spanish, and it says, Tío, tanto tiempo desde que nos hemos hablado, ¿qué pasó? Desafortunadamente me caí en sueño rápidamente después de terminar mis deberes de mi trabajo. So writing is just a way for you to think in Spanish, and also to thinking about Spanish grammar. You're thinking about how to put everything together. You can also write your grocery list in Spanish. That's very helpful, and I do that all the time. Another thing that you can do is just read in Spanish. So reading in Spanish is very good because, again, you are making sure that your brain is focusing on Spanish. You are making yourself think in Spanish because these are Spanish words and sentences that I'm physically looking at. Again, I don't have to do this. I could be just reading in English, but I'm forcing my brain to think in Spanish through reading. ¿Eran amigos tuyos esos sujetos? Pregunto. No pertenecían al consejo. Además, eran de más edad que yo y habían actuado en la época anterior a la revolución. Apenas si los conocía de vista. So this really helps me to stay in that Spanish mode. And again, this is also a great way for me to not translate, because instead of me just creating my own sentences all the time, guess what? I have some sentences right here on this page of the book that I can take and use in my conversations in Spanish. Hopefully that makes sense. I can't remember if I already mentioned this, but speaking in Spanish is also a very great way to think in Spanish, because before we actually say words, right, we are thinking about them in our minds. So we have to think before we actually speak. So that's really good. So you can be speaking to yourself in Spanish throughout the day. So kind of very similar to just thinking in your head in Spanish to yourself, or you could be actually having a conversation with native Spanish speakers, which I also highly recommend doing. And again, you don't have to be perfect, but you just do the best with what you have. So if you can't remember the right word or the right phrase, just try to use some other ones that you can think of on the spot. And the same thing goes if you are listening to content in Spanish, or if you are reading content in Spanish. You don't have to comprehend every single thing, as long as you are actually reading in Spanish, as long as you are listening to some music in Spanish, listening to a podcast in Spanish, or watching a TV show in Spanish. You're going to be activating your Spanish brain, because again, it's all about action. What is my brain currently focusing on? What am I making myself do in that moment? I could be doing all these things in English when my brain is not focusing on Spanish. I could be reading in English. I could be listening to songs in English, but I'm not making myself think about the Spanish language. I'm not thinking about Spanish grammar. I'm not thinking about accents and my pronunciation. I'm not thinking about how to piece together all these words to make sentences. But when I first started to think in Spanish, it was very challenging for me, and I was very confused about it at first, but then I started to realize that, oh wow, thinking Spanish is actually very mentally taxing. It's very tiring, especially because I'm not used to doing it. It's a completely new language and my brain is trying to process so much information. But as I continued to learn Spanish and I continued to think in Spanish consistently, it became a lot easier. Then I could think for a lot longer without taking breaks, and my head wasn't getting as tight as it would. All right, I hope you really enjoyed these tips for how you can start to think in Spanish and not translate back into your native language. Let me know in the comment section below what has helped you to think in Spanish. Also, if you like videos like this one and you would like to support my channel, you can do so through donating, and you can find information for that in the description of this video. Hasta luego.